Introduction. Why learning English feels heavy. The hidden pressure behind your effort. Most people believe English is hard because English is complicated. Most people believe progress comes from pushing harder. Most people believe discipline is the missing piece. Most people believe motivation is the fuel that creates fluency. Most people believe if they just suffer a little more, they will finally break through. And when they feel stuck, they blame themselves. They call themselves lazy. They call themselves inconsistent. They call themselves untalented. They call themselves not a language person. But I want to offer a different explanation. The problem is often not the learner. The problem is the framework the learner is trapped inside. The framework decides what you measure. The framework decides what you reward. The framework decides what you punish. And the most common English learning framework is built on pressure. It is built on outcomes. It is built on fear of falling behind. It is built on the belief that forcing yourself is the same as improving. So learners build a system that drains them. Then they try to fix the drained system with more force. Then they feel tired. Then they feel guilty. Then they push again. Then they burn out again. And they think the solution is even more willpower. But willpower is not the solution. Willpower is what you use when the system is misaligned. Willpower is what you use when the process does not naturally pull you forward. Willpower is what you use when learning does not feel meaningful. So if you constantly need willpower to learn English, something is off. That something is not your character. That something is alignment. Alignment is the relationship between who you are becoming and what you do every day. Alignment is the connection between your learning actions and the life you want to live. Alignment is what makes effort feel light instead of heavy. Misalignment is what makes effort feel heavy even when you are disciplined. In this video, we are not going to talk about tricks. We are not going to talk about hacks. We are not going to talk about magic methods. We are going to talk about the deeper mechanism behind progress. We are going to talk about why the standard model of English learning creates stress. We are going to talk about why goals can become a cage. We are going to talk about why the real target is not a score. We are going to talk about why the real target is the person you are becoming. And if you understand this, English learning becomes safer. And if English learning becomes safer, consistency becomes easier. And if consistency becomes easier, fluency becomes inevitable. Part 1. Why try harder makes many learners stuck. Insight limitation and the illusion of control. When people feel stuck in English, they usually decide to try harder. They add more hours, they add more resources, they add more pressure, they add more rules, they add more self-judgment. And for a short time, this can feel like progress. It feels like control. It feels like seriousness. It feels like commitment. But this is where the first deep problem appears. When you start learning English, you are insight limited. You do not know what you do not know. You do not yet understand what fluency really means in real life. You do not yet understand which skills matter most long term. You do not yet understand how your brain absorbs language best. You do not yet understand how your emotions shape your ability to speak. So when you design your plan, you design it with incomplete information. You design it with guesses. You design it with borrowed advice. You design it with a picture of success that might not match reality. You design it based on other people's paths. You design it based on what looks impressive. You design it based on what feels safe. And here's the trap. The more uncertain you feel, the more you crave certainty. Goals give you certainty. Timelines give you certainty. Scores give you certainty. Plans give you certainty. So you attach your emotions to the certainty. You start saying, when I reach this level, I will be confident. You start saying, when I pass this test, I will feel proud. You start saying, when I speak fluently, my life will finally open up. But you're making a promise based on insight you do not yet have. You're making a promise based on a future you haven't lived. And this can create a strange kind of suffering. You push hard towards something you don't fully understand. You then interpret every difficulty as proof you are failing. You then interpret every mistake as proof you are not good enough. You then interpret every slow week as proof your plan is broken. So you push even harder. This is why try harder often becomes a loop. It looks like discipline on the outside. It feels like anxiety on the inside. And it becomes worse when your learning is mostly abstract. Many learners study English without enough real experience. They learn rules without real conversations. They learn vocabulary without real meaning. They read texts without real emotion. They practice exercises without real consequences. So the learning doesn't turn into identity. So the learning doesn't turn into confidence. So the learning doesn't turn into natural speech. And because the results feel distant, they add even more pressure. Pressure then is used as a substitute for clarity. Pressure is then used as a substitute for strategy. Pressure is then used as a substitute for alignment. This is also where process neglect appears. Process neglect means you stop evaluating the method. Process neglect means you stop questioning whether the daily actions work. Process neglect means you keep doing more of the same because you are afraid to change. Process neglect means you treat reflection as a luxury you can't afford. You tell yourself you don't have time to rethink the process. You tell yourself you don't have time to rebuild the foundation. You tell yourself you must keep moving because the deadline is coming. But the cost of never rethinking the process is huge. It creates the feeling of running fast in the wrong direction. It creates the feeling of doing a lot without improving much. It creates the feeling of effort without reward. And that's exactly the kind of learning that burns people out. Part 1 continued. Why this feels personal. When a framework turns learning into self-judgment. A broken framework always turns into a personal story. The learner starts saying, I am bad at listening. The learner starts saying, I have no talent for speaking. The learner starts saying, I forget vocabulary too fast. The learner starts saying, I can't pronounce words correctly. The learner starts saying, my grammar is hopeless. But many of these statements are not facts. Many of these statements are emotional conclusions. They are conclusions created by pressure. They are conclusions created by comparison. They are conclusions created by a learning system that punishes mistakes. In real language acquisition, mistakes are data. In real language acquisition, confusion is feedback. In real language acquisition, slow progress is normal. But in the pressure framework, mistakes become identity. In the pressure framework, confusion becomes shame. In the pressure framework, slow progress becomes failure. So the learner stops feeling curious, so the learner stops experimenting, so the learner stops playing with language. And when curiosity dies, learning becomes heavy. That heaviness is not proof that you are weak. That heaviness is proof that the process is misaligned. That heaviness is proof that the system is draining more than it gives. Part 2. Why willpower fails. First, the cost of pushing a drained system. Now we can talk about willpower. Willpower is often treated like a magic muscle. People believe they can strengthen it forever. People believe they can push through anything with discipline. But willpower is not infinite. Willpower is a limited resource. Willpower is affected by sleep. Willpower is affected by stress. Willpower is affected by uncertainty. Willpower is affected by emotional safety. And English learning often consumes willpower in the worst way. It consumes willpower through fear. It consumes willpower through self-criticism. It consumes willpower through unclear feedback. It consumes willpower through constant comparison. It consumes willpower through the feeling of never being enough. At first, learners can tolerate this. At first, learners can force themselves. At first, learners can push through resistance. But the nervous system keeps records. The brain remembers the cost. The brain remembers the emotional pain. The brain remembers the fatigue. So the next time you sit down to study, resistance appears earlier. Resistance appears before the first word. Resistance appears before the first exercise. Resistance appears before the first listening track. That resistance is not laziness. That resistance is protection. It is your system saying, last time this hurt. It is your system saying, last time this drained me. It is your system saying, last time I felt ashamed. So willpower has to fight your own protection system. That is an unfair fight, and willpower loses that fight eventually. This is why willpower fails first. Willpower fails because it is being used as a crutch. Willpower fails because it is being used to compensate for misalignment. Willpower fails because it is being used to ignore feedback. Willpower fails because it is being used to avoid reflection. And the more you rely on willpower, the more fragile the system becomes. Because willpower does not create meaning. Because willpower does not create clarity. Because willpower does not create identity. Willpower can start the engine. Willpower cannot power the whole journey forever. A healthy learning system powers itself. A healthy learning system gives energy back. A healthy learning system creates small wins that feel real. A healthy learning system makes you feel more capable over time. A healthy learning system makes you feel safer making mistakes. A healthy learning system turns effort into growth instead of stress. Part 2 continued. How goals turn into outcome blindness when the target becomes a cage. When willpower becomes the center, goals usually become the weapon. Goals create the feeling of certainty. Goals create the feeling of direction. Goals create the feeling of control. But goals also create tunnel vision. Goals can create outcome blindness. Outcome blindness is when you become obsessed with the result. Outcome blindness is when you stop evaluating the process. Outcome blindness is when you ignore the signals that something is not working. Outcome blindness is when you refuse to adjust because adjustment feels risky. Many learners feel this when exams are involved. Many learners feel this when deadlines are involved. Many learners feel this when they compare themselves to others online. So they keep doing the same thing, even when it hurts. They keep doing the same thing even when it fails. They keep doing the same thing even when it drains them. They tell themselves they cannot change now. They tell themselves they will fix it later. They tell themselves they just need more discipline. This is where the goal becomes a coping mechanism. The goal becomes emotional comfort. The goal becomes a poster on the wall. The goal becomes a lock screen. The goal becomes a way to reduce uncertainty. But uncertainty is not always the enemy. Uncertainty can be a signal to reflect. Uncertainty can be a signal to evaluate methods. Uncertainty can be a signal to explore what actually works for you. When you remove uncertainty too early with rigid goals, you remove learning. When you remove uncertainty too early, you remove discovery. When you remove uncertainty too early, you remove the chance to update insight. And that is exactly what the original framework warns about. It warns that we often do not know enough to lock in outcomes. It warns that we often confuse the goal with what the goal represents. It warns that the result can become a cage. So, in English learning, rigid goals can trap you. They can trap you in methods that do not fit you. They can trap you in fear of changing direction. They can trap you in constant self-judgment. And the worst part is that this trap looks like seriousness. This trap looks like discipline. This trap looks like commitment. But inside, it feels like anxiety. Inside, it feels like pressure. Inside, it feels like a slow, emotional leak. That leak is what drains your system. That leak is what drains your willpower. That leak is what makes English feel heavy. Part 2 continued. The real problem is not English. The real problem is misalignment between identity and process. Here is the deepest layer. People think they are learning English, but what they are really doing is negotiating identity. They are negotiating self-worth. They are negotiating confidence. They are negotiating belonging. They are negotiating the fear of sounding foolish. They are negotiating the fear of being judged. So every mistake feels bigger than a mistake. Every hesitation feels bigger than a hesitation. Every accent feels bigger than an accent. It feels like identity is on the line, and if identity is on the line, the nervous system goes into defense. When the nervous system is defensive, learning slows down. When the nervous system is defensive, speaking becomes harder. When the nervous system is defensive, memory becomes weaker. So you push harder, and pushing harder increases defense, and defense increases resistance, and resistance increases guilt, and guilt increases pressure, and pressure increases defense again. That is the loop. That is the drained system. That is why willpower fails, because willpower is fighting identity-level misalignment, and you cannot win that fight by forcing yourself. You win that fight by changing the framework. You win that fight by changing the win condition. You win that fight by moving from outcomes to intention. Part 3. Why English goals are not really goals. Goals as emotional placeholders. At this point, we need to talk about goals directly, because goals themselves are not the enemy. The misunderstanding of goals is. Most English learners say they want a goal. They want a clear target. They want a number. They want a level. They want a certificate. But if you listen carefully, they're not really talking about English. They're talking about how they want to feel. They want to feel confident. They want to feel respected. They want to feel capable. They want to feel free. English goals are often placeholders for these feelings. If I speak English fluently, then I will feel confident. If I reach this level, then I will finally believe in myself. If I pass this exam, then my future will open up. The goal is standing in for the feeling. The problem is not having a goal. The problem is assuming the goal will automatically deliver the feeling. Because very often, it doesn't. Many people reach the level they wanted. Many people pass the test they dreamed of. Many people achieve the milestone they chased for years, and they still feel insecure. They still feel hesitant. They still feel afraid to speak. Not because the goal was wrong, but because the goal was never the real target. The real target was internal. The real target was identity. Part 3 continued. Insight limitation about fluency. Why we misjudge what good English actually means. Here's something most learners don't realize early enough. You cannot accurately imagine what fluency feels like before you experience it. From the outside, fluency looks smooth. It looks confident. It looks effortless. From the inside, fluency feels very different. It feels imperfect. It feels flexible. It feels adaptive. Fluent speakers hesitate. Fluent speakers make mistakes. Fluent speakers forget words, but they do not collapse internally when that happens. When beginners set goals, they imagine perfection. They imagine control. They imagine certainty. But language does not work like that. So learners chase an illusion. They chase a version of fluency that does not exist. And when reality does not match the illusion, they feel disappointed. They feel misled. They feel like they are failing. This disappointment is not failure. It is insight arriving late. And when insight arrives late, rigid goals become dangerous because they lock you into expectations that no longer make sense. Part 4. Why value alignment alone is not enough. The trap of thinking without living. At some point, people hear a different message. They are told to focus on values instead of goals. They are told to love English. They are told to enjoy learning. They are told to align with what matters to them. This advice sounds wise, but it has its own limitation. Values are not fixed objects waiting to be discovered. Values are constructed through experience. You do not find your learning values by thinking harder. You find them by living differently. Many learners try to define their values too early. They ask themselves what kind of learner they are. They ask themselves what motivates them. But without enough experience, these questions have no stable answer. So people borrow values. They borrow values from teachers. They borrow values from society. They borrow values from successful learners online. And then they feel misaligned. Others go in the opposite direction. They overthink everything. They analyze endlessly. They question every motivation. They get stuck. This is where intention alignment becomes necessary. Part 5. Intention alignment in English learning. Becoming instead of achieving. Intention alignment shifts the entire framework. Instead of asking what you want to achieve, you ask who you are trying to become. Instead of asking how fast you can learn English, you ask how you want English to exist in your life. Intention is softer than a goal, but it is more powerful. An intention can change. An intention can evolve. An intention can be updated. And that is not weakness. That is intelligence. When you learn English with intention, you are not forcing yourself toward an outcome. You are experimenting with identity. You are asking, what happens if I live like this person for a while? What happens if I am someone who listens deeply? What happens if I am someone who speaks even when unsure? What happens if I am someone who learns in public instead of hiding? You do not need certainty to start. You only need willingness. Part 6. The experiential learning cycle applied to English. How alignment is built in real life. Intention alignment works because it follows how humans actually learn. You start with a hypothesis. You guess who you want to be as an English learner. Then you live it. You expose yourself to real English. You interact even when it feels uncomfortable. You use the language imperfectly. Then you reflect. You ask how it felt. You ask what drained you. You ask what energized you. Then you abstract. You ask what this experience tells you about yourself. You ask what kind of learning suits you. You ask what kind of environments help you grow. And then you adjust. This cycle never ends, and that's the point. The process itself becomes fulfilling. You no longer feel like learning starts later. You no longer feel like success is delayed. You are already living in alignment. Part 7. Why this approach creates real fluency. Why growth becomes inevitable. When people hear this approach, they often worry about one thing. They worry that without pressure, progress will slow down. They worry that without strict goals, they will become lazy. They worry that without deadlines, they will drift. This fear makes sense because most people have only ever experienced growth through force, but intention alignment removes unnecessary resistance. There is a big difference. When learning English is misaligned, every minute of effort feels heavy. Every mistake feels personal. Every slow week feels threatening. But when learning is aligned, effort starts to feel lighter over time. Not because English suddenly becomes easy, but because your system is no longer fighting itself. Your nervous system is no longer in defense mode. Your attention is no longer split between learning and self-judgment. Your energy is no longer wasted on anxiety. And this changes everything. Listening improves because you are actually present. You are not listening to judge yourself. You are listening to understand. Speaking improves because you are not waiting to be perfect. You are willing to try. You are willing to sound incomplete. Vocabulary grows because words are connected to meaning. They are connected to ideas. They are connected to experiences. Grammar improves because it is absorbed, not forced. It becomes pattern recognition, not memorization. This is what people misunderstand about fluency. Fluency is not built by pushing harder. Fluency is built by removing friction. When learning English stops threatening your identity, your brain becomes curious again, and curiosity is far more powerful than discipline. This is why intention alignment does not slow progress, it accelerates it, because progress no longer depends on motivation spikes. It depends on a system that sustains itself. You are no longer asking, how do I force myself to learn today? You are asking, how do I live today as someone who uses English? And when that becomes the question, learning stops feeling like work. Part 8. English as identity, not performance. The end of self-judgment. For most learners, English feels like a performance. They feel watched, they feel judged, they feel evaluated. Every sentence feels like a test, every mistake feels like exposure. This is exhausting. When English is a performance, your self-worth is always at risk. You are not just speaking, you are defending yourself. So your system stays tense, and tense systems do not learn well. Intention alignment changes this relationship completely. English stops being something you prove. It becomes something you use. You stop trying to sound impressive. You start trying to be understood. You stop trying to hide mistakes. You start using mistakes as feedback. You stop asking whether you sound good enough. You start asking whether the message landed. This shift is subtle, but it is profound, because identity is no longer on trial. You are no longer saying, if I speak badly, I am bad at English. You are saying, I am learning, and this is part of the process. That single shift removes enormous pressure, and when pressure disappears, something unexpected happens. Confidence begins to emerge naturally. Not the loud kind of confidence, but the quiet kind. The confidence that comes from knowing you are allowed to be where you are. English becomes part of your life, not a barrier you have to climb over. You use it to think. You use it to explore ideas. You use it to connect with people. And slowly, without forcing it, you notice something important. You are no longer chasing fluency. You are living as someone who uses English. And that is when fluency finally arrives. Conclusion. The real reason you were struggling. Why English was never the problem. If you take a step back, you may start to see something clearly now. You were never failing because you were lazy. You were never failing because you lacked discipline. You were never failing because English was too difficult. You were struggling because you were trying to grow inside a framework that worked against you. A framework that told you pressure creates progress, force creates fluency, goals guarantee confidence. And when those promises did not come true, you blamed yourself. But learning English was never meant to feel like a constant fight. Language is not built through fear. Language is not built through self-judgment. Language is not built through forcing identity to change overnight. Language is built through use, through experience, through gradual alignment between who you are and what you do. The moment you stop asking, how fast can I reach this level, and start asking, who am I becoming while I learn, everything shifts. Learning stops being something you endure. It becomes something you live. You no longer wait for confidence to arrive at the finish line. Confidence grows along the way. You no longer postpone fulfillment until you are fluent. Fulfillment becomes part of the process. You realize something important. The goal was never the score. The goal was never the certificate. The goal was never sounding perfect. The real goal was always alignment. Alignment between your learning and your identity. Alignment between your effort and your values. Alignment between your daily actions and the life you want to live. When learning is aligned, you are already succeeding. And when you are already succeeding, progress no longer feels fragile. It becomes stable. It becomes resilient. It becomes inevitable. So if you are learning English right now and you feel tired, and you feel behind, and you feel discouraged, this is not a sign to push harder. It is a sign to realign, to slow down enough to listen to yourself, to allow learning to be imperfect, to allow identity to evolve naturally. You do not need to force fluency. You need to create the conditions for it. And when those conditions are in place, English stops being something you chase. It becomes something you carry with you. And that's when learning finally feels right.